Okay, so in this lecture and the next, I want to start talking about diagramming arguments. And diagramming arguments is a pretty simple, well, at least initially simple. It can get a little complicated, as you guys will see, but it's a fairly simple way of getting a better idea of what the structure of an argument is, how the premises support the conclusion. And, last time we talked about, or actually a few lectures ago, we talked about, well, this numbered premises and conclusion form, that sometimes the order is important. By revealing the structure of an argument a little better, diagramming will tell us a bit more about what order they should go in. But maybe most importantly, diagramming an argument just at the outset will tell us how much the argument depends on each premise, or give us some idea of this at least. It'll at the very least tell us whether an argument can survive a premise being false or someone rejecting them. Some arguments, if a premise or two is false, it weakens the argument, but the thing doesn't fall apart entirely. Other arguments, premise plays a key role, the whole argument is going to fall apart if it's not true. Okay. So when we diagram an argument, there are two basic ways the premises can support the conclusion: dependent support and independent support. We'll talk about independent support in this lecture, and we'll talk about dependent support in next lecture. I'll say a bit more about this. Inductive arguments can have either of these. Strictly speaking, deductive arguments work with dependent support. It can be a little more complicated, as Lavin mentions, but this is generally the case. Deductive arguments are going to have dependent support. Inductive can have either. And an exception to this, and if this doesn't make sense to you guys, don't worry. We might see this pop going forward, and Lavin mentions it. One exception might be when somebody makes two deductive arguments or three deductive arguments that all justify the same conclusion. And people might do this as a matter of overkill, just in case one argument doesn't work. I might make it a deductive argument that war is wrong because it kills people, and I might make another one that war is wrong because it uses resources that could be better spent elsewhere. Those might both be deductive. They might support the same conclusion. That's possible. Strictly speaking, though, you should expect deductive arguments to have dependent support. Anyway, that might not make a lot of sense to you guys just yet because we haven't talked about what these kinds of support are. So let's get into it. Independent support means that the premises on their own provide support for the conclusion. Each premise, standing on its own, gives some support to the conclusion. And what this means is if one premise is false, then the others still provide some support, though the conclusion might now have less support. Here's an example. The FDA wouldn't approve the COVID vaccines unless they were safe. And I know dozens of people who've taken them with no bad reactions, so the COVID vaccines are safe. Both 1 and 2 give you independent reasons to think that 3 is true. Now, you might get a sense, and this is actually true, that 1 gives you a lot more reason than 2 does. The FDA does studies hundreds of thousands of people, and dozens of people, but both of these give you some reason to think 3 is true. This is the way you diagram independent support. 1 and 2 both pointing to 3, giving some support for this claim. And notice, if you reject either premise, the remaining premise still gives you some support for the claim. Not as much, But the FDA wouldn't approve the COVID vaccines unless they were safe. Still gives you some support for this claim the vaccines are safe. I know dozens of people who've taken the vaccines with no bad effects. Again, this is probably not the better of the two premises, but it gives you a bit of support, right? It's not huge, it's not super compelling, it's not a great argument, but there is some support here, right? If dozens of people do something and don't have a bad reaction, it is some evidence that the thing is safe, right? Here's another argument with independent support. Smoking causes cancer. Smoking causes breathing problems. Smoking causes heart disease. You know, in the sense that smoking makes each of these things much more likely than if you don't smoke, right? Conclusion, smoking is very bad for your health. Diagram here, 1, 2, 3, all give you, independently of each other, they give you some reason to think smoking is very bad for your health, right? Smoking causes cancer, that alone is a good reason to think it's bad for your health. If it causes heart disease, again, some reason to think it's bad for your health. And notice we can drop a premise and the argument, the remaining two still have some force, right? If smoking causes cancer and it causes heart disease, that's some reason to think it's very bad for your health, right? Even number one on its own, smoking causes cancer, is some reason to think it's very bad for your health, right? The argument isn't as strong as it used to be, but the premises that are left still have some force. They don't require each other to support the conclusion.